Thank you. It's such an honor and privilege to be here again. I always love coming to Ireland and working with Safe Ireland and all of their wonderful member programs. I felt like I was old home week seeing some of the wonderful folks here today. I've been working with Safe Ireland since 2006 on a variety of different projects, and it has seemed often like we've had a lot of parallel issues going on between the United States and Ireland. And so we've been having this wonderful cross-country knowledge exchange, and we've learned so much from each other and borrowed each other's strategies and tools. But I have to say, the one area that I never thought that the work that I did in the US would resonate here in Ireland was around housing and homelessness. Because in the United States, we've had a serious problem with homelessness for a very long time. We don't actually think people are entitled to housing in the United States. Guns, yes. Housing, no. So, and that's always been something, one of the many things I've been impressed with in Ireland and much of the European countries. And I was talking with Katrina recently about some of the work that I was doing, because I'm very excited about the work that we're doing in the US around ending homelessness for domestic violence survivors. And as I was telling her about the horrible problem and everything that our services are dealing with and all of the issues we're facing, she said, we're having exactly that happening here in Ireland. And I have to say, I was shocked. It was painful to hear that. But so the only positive is that I now get to share with you some really exciting and innovative things going on in the US and hearing what might be happening here in similar ways. And so once again, I hope that we can learn from each other across our countries. So, as many of you know, in both the US and Ireland, there simply isn't enough housing. There isn't enough, especially lower income housing. A lot of people simply cannot afford housing on how much money they make. And having experienced domestic violence makes housing stability even more difficult, and a lot of people aren't making that connection, and they don't understand that. So for those of you who may not be aware in here, there has been some research done in the US that has shown that housing instability, so losing your house or being at risk of losing your house, is 4 times more likely for women who've experienced domestic violence. And when we've done research with women who are homeless and asked them, why are you homeless? What has precipitated this? 1 in 4 cite domestic violence as a major contributor to their homelessness. And 80% have experienced domestic violence as adults, 80%. And the one study I did find here in Ireland found 67% of a sample of homeless women in Ireland had experienced domestic violence. So it's large, it's complicated. People want to know, how does domestic violence lead to homelessness? Well, there's 2 ways. There's a direct pathway and there's an indirect pathway. Directly, you have many abusers who are trying to make it difficult for women and children to have stable housing. It's a way to prevent someone from leaving the relationship. It's a way of continuing control. So many abusers intentionally destroy women's credit. They intentionally prevent them from working, from going to school, from having their car working. They'll harass them at work or at school and get them fired. They'll cause property damage and get them removed from their apartments. So sometimes it's very direct and intentional. But there's also indirect pathways, and that's that we know that domestic violence, as you heard, is very severe. It leads to many injuries. It can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. It can lead to depression. And when you're experiencing all of that, it can make it difficult to go to work. You can lose a lot of days of work. It can make it difficult to stay up on your schoolwork if you're in school. You're trying to take your children sometimes and be safe, and yet you're leaving the stable home in order to provide safety for the children. So there's both direct and indirect pathways, and it's quite a serious problem And so here, I know I've been talking with a number of you and with Safe Ireland. I know that you're all trying very innovative responses here. And we're trying very innovative responses in the US as well to deal with this very complex problem. We know the first thing is we need more housing. We simply need more lower income housing for people. But in addition to that, our service providers are trying to think about other ways to either prevent domestic violence victims from becoming homeless or to get them rehoused and safely housed. So I want to just talk with you very briefly about that today. I don't know how many of you are familiar with housing models, and again, I'm talking in the US, although I know there's a lot of international work around this as well. So there's a housing first model. So in the homeless world, and in the US, the housing first model has really been developed with the idea of single men in mind. Single men, many of whom are veterans, many of whom have either severe mental health issues and or substance abuse issues. Okay, and housing first, the idea was, okay, so let me tell you, in the past, it was, well, we have to deal with the mental illness first, or we have to deal with the substance abuse first, and then get someone housed. Housing first came from evidence that showed that actually the opposite is true. That the first thing you have to do is stabilize someone's housing. So you get them into housing, and then you provide the supports that they need to deal with mental illness, mental health issues, substance abuse. And a lot of evidence has showed that this housing first model works. But again, it was not set up for domestic violence survivors. And so the domestic violence service community has now come along and said, we want to take what works about that model, but use a domestic violence informed lens. So we're calling it domestic violence housing first. And the idea is, yes, get someone into housing, but you need to use very intensive advocacy. And when I say mobile advocacy, that's a term we're using in the States, meaning you're getting out into the person's home, into their community, to work with them. They're not coming to you, but you're working with them in the community. And using flexible funding to help someone stay housed. The traditional housing first model is sort of people may need about 3 months of financial assistance and advocacy work and social services, and then they should be on their own. What we're finding with domestic violence survivors, and again, we're at the very, very early stages, but that 3-month period seems very short. In the US, we made a commitment 10 years ago to end homelessness for our war veterans. And I have to say we've made a huge difference. We've cut homelessness against war veterans by a third, Lynn, is it? Is it 2/3 now? It's been a huge, huge decrease. Okay? It's actually been very effective. But now we're looking at that and saying, with veterans who have PTSD, the war is over. With domestic violence survivors who have PTSD, they have an active abuser who is still trying to prevent their housing stability, who is still jeopardizing their safety. It's going to take a similar but a nuanced approach. So I'm actually doing some research on the domestic violence housing first model, and I'm not going to share that with you today. Because, one, we don't have time, two, we're at the very beginning process. And it's a great way to get myself invited back. You know, as I get too excited, and then I say, well, if I come back, I can tell you about that. But similar to that, I mentioned flexible funding. You know, somebody, they need their rent paid for a couple of months. Some people need a security deposit paid, or back rent taken care of, or credit taken care of, so that they can move. But other people, they may need their car repaired so that they can continue going to work. They may have had their eyeglasses broken and need eyeglasses to see. So sometimes it's a small amount of money, sometimes it's a more significant amount of money, but that flexible funding means we need to have some funding set aside that the funders haven't said this can only be used in this way. So our housing funder in the US will say, here's flexible funding, but the flexible funding can only be used for security deposits and paying rent, and I think paying off some back rent. Well, I call that semi-flexible funding. Okay, we need actual flexible funding to respond to any need that a survivor has that's impacting their housing stability. So, where did this idea come up from? Well, two things. One is we were realizing we were often starting providing services too late. Okay? We can avoid homelessness. We can help some survivors actually avoid becoming homeless if they have access to these immediate and flexible funds. So, for example, in some locations in the U.S., a survivor might call and say, my husband slashed the tires on my car. And it's going to mean I can't take my children to school and I can't go to work. And if I can't go to work, I'm going to lose my apartment. And the domestic violence refuge would say, well, we don't have $800, $900 to fix your tires, but you can bring your children into refuge. Okay. So now she has had to move out of her home. She's possibly moved to a different area. She's now destabilized her house, and it's costing a lot more money than it would have to give her the $800 to have the car tires fixed. So this was one idea, is can we actually prevent homelessness? Can we prevent people from coming into refuge in the first place? And then international aid studies, more and more, are showing that this having fast cash, basically, is one of the best interventions we can have for alleviating poverty and homelessness. So taking that, more and more programs are trying to figure out, would flexible funding actually make a difference? Is this something worth doing? And that's what I do as a researcher at Michigan State. A lot of my research is focused on, does it work? So people have these wonderful, innovative ideas, but the funders, the policymakers, the public, they always want to know, where's the evidence? Okay, it sounds like a good idea, but does it work? And so that's the kind of work that I do, and I'm evaluating right now a very innovative domestic violence service program in Washington, D.C. It's called DASH, which stands for the District Alliance for Safe Housing, which is why we call it DASH. It's a lot easier. So DASH provides a range of services I want to just very quickly tell you about. Remember, the U.S. is a bit larger than Ireland. Okay? So their refuge is a 43-unit apartment-style refuge. Many of our refuges, like yours, are communal living, but we're moving more and more away from that and trying to provide more apartment-style housing so that families are still getting services, but they have more privacy and it's not as stressful and traumatizing as living communally with people. So this is a 43-unit apartment-style refuge. I would say that that's on the higher end of our size. They also have a 20, I wouldn't say it's a 20-unit. They have enough money to pay for 20 families to go into transitional housing, but we call it transition to permanent housing. They help survivors find an apartment that they think in a couple of years they could afford, and then DASH pays for that apartment for them and provides them services for 2 years, with the idea that after 2 years they can stay there. So the downside of transitional housing is you stay there for 2 years and then you have to move again. So this is transition to permanent. That's enough for 20 families. And then they have their housing resource center. And that's where they do more of their homelessness prevention, where it might just be, I don't need refuge, I don't need a new place to live, I need some advocacy to help me stay where I am, or I can afford to move into this other place that I have found if I just have this more rapid assistance. So they're very good at DASH, at really having those good conversations with survivors right up front and assessing, what is it this person really needs? Do they need really intensive, extensive refuge services? Do they need something less? So that they're really trying to make sure that the right amount of money is spent and the right amount of services are provided. So they call their flexible funding account the Survivor Resilience Fund. And when they told me about this fund, I just was so impressed with it that I just begged them to let me evaluate it. And they were kind enough to let me do that. So first of all, I said to them, well, how do you know? How do you decide who gets funding and how much to give? And are there caps? And, this has got to be complicated. So they have 4 overriding questions, really. The first is, can any other organization provide this funding? So we have different funding sources, say, to pay that utility bill that needs to be paid. If there's anywhere else they can get the funding, they do that so that they're saving this very flexible funding for where they absolutely need it. The second question is, will this grant help someone not just today but over time? So if I go to them and I say I can't afford to pay my rent this month, they're going to want to know, well, if we help pay the rent this month, is there reason to believe you can pay it next month? Okay. And if not, then they would probably say it may make more sense for you to go into refuge or some other option. So it really is this something that can work over time? They have a very survivor-centered philosophy at DASH. They want their services to be low barrier. They don't limit it. They get people who other organizations have turned away because of either mental illness, substance abuse problems, just being difficult to work with, whatever it might be. A lot of other organizations have said, we don't want to deal with you, DASH will, and they're very about being respectful to survivors and their children. And the other thing they really stress with this kind of a program is the importance of being fast. That these are people who are in crisis right now. And if the crisis is not averted right now, then they will end up homeless. Then they will end up needing to be in refuge where maybe we could have prevented it. So those were the guiding principles behind their work. And let me just very quickly tell you our research plan. After a survivor was given a grant from DASH, the worker would say, there are some people at Michigan State University who would like to talk with you by phone about how this is working or not working for you. Would you be willing to have them contact you? So it was always after the grant. It was completely voluntary. We paid the survivors to talk with us. And if they said yes, then we called them 30 days after they got the grant, because we thought 30 days is long enough to see, did it provide that immediate stabilization? But of course the question is, were they stable over time? So we then interviewed them in 3 months and in 6 months. I would have loved to go longer than that, but again, we were doing this almost for free and just couldn't do it. So this was really a pilot study. We had 55 survivors who agreed to talk with us, and we had a very high retention rate, meaning we were able to keep locating them and talking with them over time, which was a pretty impressive feat of my incredible graduate student, Heather, because this is all happening in Washington, D.C., and we're doing all these phone interviews from Michigan. But we were able to reach 95% at 3 months and 87% at 6 months. Very quickly, I'll just tell you a little bit about this sample, very typical of the Washington, D.C. area in which DASH is located. It was 53 women. There were 2 male survivors. The average age was 34, primarily African American. Most of them had children. 82% had children with them, with an age range, a number of children ranging from 0 to 4. So let's get at the amount of funding that they were approved for. So the amounts of grants that they got, the average grant size was a little over $2,000. Now this is higher than a lot of our domestic violence programs have funding for. This would be seen as quite a bit of money to have for flexible funding. Some were very small. Some were as small as $275. That would be more the get a tire fixed, get glasses repaired or replaced. $275, all the way up to one woman needing $8,500. Grants were used for a variety of things, as you can see here. Everything from moving expenses, past utility bills, back rent, storage unit fees, where someone had all of her personal belongings, everything the family had in a storage unit, and now everything was going to be auctioned off. Okay, and she would have had to start over if she hadn't had that. A woman who was dealing with a custody issue in another state, and if she couldn't get to that state, she was going to lose custody of her children. So very flexible types of ways that this money was needed, but it was needed now. So let's cut to the chase. Everyone always wanted to know, did it work? How many people were stable? So this was taking people who were either already homeless or many were on the brink of homelessness, and how many were housed at 6 months. Yay! Okay, this is great, huh? Is this great? ended up in DASH, every single one of them would have cost me $20,000 a year. $20,000. And on average it cost me $2,000. So her attitude is, even if a family has another crisis and they come back 2 or 3 times, it's still cheaper for me than having that family come into refuge, and they're not less stable because of it. Now, it is not a magic pill that's going to work for everyone. It does only work for people in certain circumstances where things were pretty stable for them. Okay, things were going along pretty stably, and then a crisis. Let me give you one example. A woman who was married to her husband for a number of years. She worked the night shift, and so she would leave him the rent to pay to the landlord, and he'd been doing that for years, and they had a 4-year-old child together. He became very violent, and the police came, and he was taken away and put in jail. She comes home from the police station, and there's a notice that she's about to be evicted on her apartment door. She had no idea because she had been paying the rent, so she thought. Turns out for the last 3 months, he had not been paying the rent, and when the notices were coming from the landlord, he was hiding them. So she was the woman who now is $8,000 in arrears. She says to Dash, I have a good job, I'm not in danger right now, and I do not want to disrupt my 4-year-old child's life. But there is no way I have $8,000 or can come up with $8,000 for this back rent. So they paid it, and she was fine. So that's an example of things had been pretty stable, and there's just a crisis that happens. But as you can see, at 6 months, 3 people were homeless, and 3 were quite concerned that they were going to become homeless. They had lost their jobs, they had a serious health issue. So this doesn't work for everyone. Nothing that we do works for everyone, but it did seem to work for quite a few folks. Let me just briefly tell you about that. It's not just getting the money, it's the process that was so important to survivors. And I wish I had more time to go into this with you. Bring me back. So Dash wanted to know, when I evaluated this, they said, we care about whether people are housed, but we also want to know if we're providing the services in the way that we believe we are, which is, are they low barrier, are they fast, and do survivors feel that we care and are non-judgmental. So I just have a few quotes for you. The one woman who said, when I went to Dash, they were more willing to listen to my story, ask some questions, okay, we can help you, and that was it. It wasn't like, okay, we need you to join our program, we need you to sit down, we need you to come in every day, we need you to come in. It wasn't like that. I didn't feel like, she paused and said, I didn't feel like somebody put a gun to my head. I mean, to, receive help. Okay, now that's a very American thing to say. You probably wouldn't hear people refer to having a gun put to their head, but again, I'm from the States. But especially people who were going to their more traditional housing service providers, this is how they were often felt like they were treated, is prove to me that you need this help. Prove to me that you're really a victim. Prove to me that you've done everything. Another issue was it fast? It's very difficult to use money quickly in bureaucracies, right? And so this was an issue about, how do we get this to people fast without having to have 4 different people in our program sign off and go to the funder and get permission? And they did manage to do that. So as one woman said, I expected to be there for hours. I had brought as much information that I could possibly find, because I just assumed that it would be a long day there and it would be 1,000,001 questions, and it was totally the opposite. It was totally the opposite, and it was very refreshing. People talked to us about that they had their rent paid within a day. That they came to Dash and said, I'm being evicted, I need this paid, and it was paid within a day. Okay, that's extremely unusual. And then also, finally, was it caring and non-judgmental? Because we know that it's difficult to ask for services and to receive services. And so this is a very important philosophy of Dash's. And one survivor said, usually you talk to someone like that, meaning a service provider, and it's more like, oh, well, I would have did this, or I would have did that. And it wasn't like that. It was more like they understood. I didn't have to hear, oh, well, why didn't you leave? Or, I didn't get that from them. And we heard that over and over and over again, and how much that just helped them feel like they hadn't done something wrong, and if there wasn't something wrong with them, that they needed help. So these were qualitative interviews. We just would call and ask how things were going, and we noticed how often the parents talked about their children, and how critical this was to their children, and how horrified they were at the thought of being homeless with their children. And that this was probably the greatest thing for them, was knowing that their children were now feeling better and more stable. So as one woman said, my daughter used to be kind of violent with her doll babies, and having tantrums, slamming doors. And now it's more relaxed, so she's more calm with her doll babies. She's not ripping doll babies' heads off. That's a positive outcome. So as I mentioned, we started out, we wanted this to be very open and conversational and see what came up in the conversations. But we realized about midway after we'd been doing this for a while that we did want to start asking at the final interview a couple of quantitative questions, a couple of questions that we could actually get some numbers from. So we decided midway through that at the last interview, we now had enough of a good relationship with the survivors that the advocate could say, so thinking back over the last 6 months, when you went to DASH for these funds, would you say that overall your life is better off, worse off, or no change? And we asked, and would you say you're more hopeful about the future, less hopeful about the future, or no change? 100% said that they were better off in their lives overall, and 90% felt more hopeful. And I want to say, of the people who said no to the more hopeful, I think there's only 2 of them, and they both said, I've always been a hopeful person. So it's not that anyone felt less hopeful, it's just that some felt like they had always been hopeful. Impact on their safety, we also decided to ask more specifically because we were noticing no one was talking about domestic violence, and we weren't sure if that meant they were safe or not, so we started asking people, have they experienced more domestic violence? So again, we only asked 23 people the question, and of the 23, 20 or 91% reported no further domestic violence. 1 person reported receiving harassing phone calls, and 2 did experience further domestic violence. Because it's very important that people are not just housed, but safely housed. So our next steps are really, we're trying to identify where else this is happening, who else is doing flexible funding, what are the differences in the programs and in the areas in which these programs are happening, so that we can understand what works about this. This was one study in one area, and while it's very promising, it certainly just is promising. We need a lot more information about this. But I will say that we have a number of government offices in the U.S. who have been extremely interested in hearing about this study. Why? Let's be honest, it's probably very cost effective. Okay? And they care about that. And that's fine. They should care about that. We can say we like it because it seems to be effective, and if they say we like it because it's cost effective, whatever gets us more money, I don't care, right? But we've had, so our housing authority, our Department of Housing and Urban Development, is very excited about this, and they want to hear more. And it's been wonderful to see them turning to the domestic violence community and our national domestic violence organizations and saying, you know what, we knew how to end homelessness against veterans. We don't really know how to end family violence and family homelessness. Can you help us work together? And I want to just say, because she will not take credit for it, but a lot of this I give credit to Lynn Rosenthal, who was our first White House advisor. Our federal housing department, it was always no secret that at the federal level, our housing department and then our Office on Violence Against Women, or, we're clashing a lot, It was one of these like, well, the domestic violence people don't like the housing people, and the housing people don't like the domestic violence people, and nobody was talking with each other. And Lynn Rosenthal took a lot of time to talk with a key person in housing and urban development. And it wasn't always easy, and they both will talk about it. They had conflicts, they had disagreements, but they had a credible amount of respect for each other, and they listened to each other, and for the first we are seeing significant cooperation among these government agencies, and it is making a huge difference on what we are able to do at the local level to end homelessness for domestic violence survivors. And so we're very excited. Again, first steps, but I was excited to share this with you, and I look forward to hearing more about what you're doing here. So thank you very much.